I'm here today with Rick Prashaw. Rick is a Canadian author, keynote speaker, and storyteller. He's had a diverse career as a journalist, Roman Catholic priest, executive director of a national criminal justice NGO, and political staff to 3 members of parliament. His son, Adam, inspired him to be an advocate for both transgender human rights and organ donorship. He's a winner of the National Ron Weeb Restorative Justice Award. Rick's first memoir, Soar, Adam, Soar, is based on the remarkable life of his son, Adam, who tragically passed away in 2016. His new book, Father Rick, Roamin Catholic, Roman as in Roamin, Catholic, is his second memoir, now available from Friesen Press. Rick is crazy about politics, social justice, sports, and dogs. He's still chasing ideals and dreams, but humor is mandatory. You can learn more at rickprashaw.com, rickprashaw.com. So Rick, thanks so much for joining us, and congratulations on all your work.
Thank you, Brian. It's really good to see you again. And,
yeah, same here.
To have this conversation.
Good to catch up, and I was really glad to hear about the release of your second book. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. Some people joke that I've started a new religion, and I just tell them, no, we have enough religions out there. Just be good at your own one. And but I definitely, with that title and the play on words of Roman and roaming, clearly it intrigues people, and clearly it describes a good number of other Catholics. In their faith journey.
So before we get into the book, why don't you tell people a little bit more about your varied background? I just barely touched on it.
You know, Brian, there was a time as a priest, I remember being at a cottage that several young priests have. And I remember on a national radio show, this very well-known man, Peter Zowski, talking about the average Canadian, even back in 1980s, would have 9 careers.
Wow. And
I remember, probably with some smugness and arrogance, saying to myself, not me. You know, I'm set for life. You know, I was a journalist briefly and then a Catholic priest. And I said, that's my story. I'm not going to bump up to 9. Well, I laugh because I think I've hit 9 now.
Oh, wow. You're up to 9.
I think I've hit 9. I went from priesthood to marriage and an NGO, working in criminal justice. And then I had 3 different political staff working with federal members of parliament on all good social justice campaigns. I've been an usher at the Blue Jays and an usher at the Senators hockey games for the NHL hockey team in Ottawa. And then I retired, and now I'm an author. So I'm very close to 9.
That's great. Well, good for you. I mean, entrepreneurial, I would say. You're always looking for new things to do and get involved in, which I always love to see. So, but obviously a lot of our audience are authors. So why don't you tell us how you decided to start that?
Well, it's interesting. I remember sitting on my bundle of newspapers in Northern Ontario as a little boy, and I would devour the paper. I would read it front to back. My customers would, somewhat angry, but mostly just think it was hilarious to see me reading the paper, their paper, rather than delivering it, you know? So I was just into the news and the world. And then it started fascinating me, the writing of these stories and these correspondents that would, you know, go around the world and report. You know, then these were Bobby Kennedy days and Man to the Moon days, and so writing and the news fascinated me, and I think I say in the book, from maybe 12 years of age, I knew what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a journalist. I would skip career days because I was one of the few people that I had my life figured out. I was going to be a journalist, and I loved it. And author wasn't really there then. It was reporting. It was telling the stories. You know, I was fascinated by stories and how interesting it was that I could tell stories. You know, so that was I guess the seeds for the author life. And now I belong to several authors groups, and enough of us lament that we started late in life, but it's true. I could have started a lot sooner. I wrote for all my other bosses. I wrote for church bosses and political bosses and NGO bosses. And there came a time just on the cusp of senior years, I said, I really want to write for myself, and I knew that there were books in there. But the joke, Brian, and I don't know if you can identify with it, is that on those writers groups, I say, hey, okay, maybe we're late, but boy, do we have a lot of stuff from life to write about, So it was like I had no problems thinking of stories to tell from this long life,
Sure. And I mean, I think our age, it gives us a perspective that I know at least I didn't have when I was younger.
Right. And there's an Indigenous novelist in Canada, Thomas King, and he won a Massey Lecture Award series. And he had this gorgeous phrase that he, as a storyteller, and the Indigenous people have some magnificent storytelling traditions. He said, tell your story, lay it down at the audience's feet, and may they do with your story what they wish. And I love that image that, I have had times in the pulpit preaching and proselytizing. I was never a damnation guy. I was never that type of preacher, but I was a preacher and I had good news to share. And yet in this author time, I find it's the stories to tell. And especially in these polemic and polarized worlds and universes that maybe it's age, maybe it's wisdom, maybe it's tiredness. I don't know what it is, but I'm not into the debates anymore. The winning, scoring argument, winning, losing, right, wrong. I'd like to tell stories. And that's what I do in both the books. I just try, not always successful, to lay them down and let the audience make of them, as they wish.
So I mentioned the new book is called Father Rick, Roamin Catholic, as in roaming. What motivated you to write that book?
It probably was going to be my first book, and then the news of Adam with both his gender journey and the tragedy involving a seizure-related, drowning. I knew I wanted to tell my son's story and his journey home to the boy he always knew who he was, and we knew who he was. So that kind of jumped into the queue for writing, but I knew I had a story to write. And I noticed, Brian, when I would go on my book tour, I cobbled together like 35 cities around Ontario, Quebec, Vermont, California, because I had sisters there. The fact that I was a priest, and then I married, and then I had this kid who takes me on this gender journey. Well, that's all anybody seemed to want to talk about. And it was a confirmation to me that I had another book to tell.
Interesting.
And so I do go back to Adam's story and talk about that from a faith lens and from a big God lens. But I knew I had a lot more, that in this, I call it my crooked straight journey to heaven's door. I grew up in a vibrant Catholic church, Vatican II period, the community, social hubs, social justice, a preferential option for the poor with Gutierrez and the liberation theology people. It was exciting. And I had a pretty dramatic calling because I was so embedded in journalism and in good times and long hair and rock and roll in the 70s. So I tell that story. It's a long story, but it was a very dramatic vocation calling. I was visiting a priest in Seattle who happened to be a cousin of mine. And God decided enough was enough, Rick. That was the moment that he just zapped me with a deep awareness that would never, ever alter all my life, even after ending and choosing marriage and choosing love and choosing a family, that I knew that was an authentic calling and that it was enough to have me leave my first love, which was journalism. And I never imagined it happening. And so I tell that calling in the book, But it was 11 years. It flew by, and it was good years. There was good memories. And in the Facebook generation that we live now, I have all these old parishioners and youth who are now in their 40s and 50s with their teenagers and, wringing their hands. And they circle back and they finish stories and they tell stories and they remind me how good it was. And things that I long forgot that I did and said. I believe God using me and grace involved in all of it. Things that stayed with them that I had said, that I had done, that I completely had long ago forgotten. And they were coming back and like finishing the story for me. So I guess with some of the bad news and religions and sometimes what gets on page one of our newspapers, people always wanted to know why I left the priesthood because, they're in the back of their head, they're thinking, well, there's the abuse scandal and all of that. And I said, no, I left for love. I left for love and I left for family. It was a huge struggle of mine. There were fellow priests that I knew were living celibacy well. It seemed to have the charism. For me, it was a struggle. It was always a struggle. I wasn't a priest sort of waiting to marry. I lived it well. I lived it fully. In fact, Brian, I have to tell a story of myself that's in the book. Again, it's a bit of smugness and arrogance, I think, because I'd hear news of a friend leaving to get married. And I remember being shocked and then saying to myself, not me.
Wow.
I would say that, and it wasn't like I was better than them. I just said, that's not on for me. So it's a long way of answering your question to say there were good priest years, really good priest years, social justice years, going to Chicago every year for this liturgical conference. It was just lit. You'd be on fire going back into the parish, Bill Bausch in New Jersey and Joseph Champlin, a pastor in New York, and Edwina Gately talking about a big God as she worked with sex workers and opened up Genesis House, and John Shea, who taught me to always rework the stories, make them your stories, so that when you tell the Jesus stories, make them your stories. You don't have to be literal. Make that work in your life. And so it was the 80s and early 90s, and it was really exciting times for me personally, my faith journey and the faith communities.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One of the things you mentioned in your book is you describe your childhood family life as a Catholic cuckoo's nest. What do you mean by that?
If you don't mind, I'd like to read that part.
Sure.
Because it really is. It sounds like I'm making fun and mocking, and I wasn't. Because Catholics who are in your audience, millions of people live this. If it's not your story, then it was your parents' story or your grandparents' story. Or if you were a Protestant and you hung out with Catholics, this story. So it was this holy water, the making the sign of the cross like you were putting out a fire on your shirt. There was the Lenten practices, the nervousness, the standing in line for confession. I was so embarrassed as an altar boy. We'd get in our finest surplice and cassocks, and we'd parade to the neighborhood. Thank God it wasn't Belfast. We weren't getting thrown with, rocks or apples or anything, but, oh my God, I'm mortified if anybody sees me. So it was all those stories that I told on myself. And then I had a lot of friends who on Facebook told me their stories. So I put some of them in the book, and the nuns, the straps, the good and the bad. So I end that whole section with this reflection. Like the media, I report here on what makes news. If it bleeds, it leads. We bled. Still, like the kid digging through the manure pile, certain there was a horse underneath. The stories remind me that as a Catholic, I also learned how to pray, share, practice the golden rule, say sorry, and discover the good in being good. There was a purpose to living. Dad and Mom's mission was to pass the faith on to their children and to lead us into heaven. I do not mock any of that. Mom and Dad walked their faith with us as they treated all people with the same dignity reminding us that differences were more fascinating than threatening, that vulnerable individuals had difficult lives, not of their own choosing, that they were every bit as good as we were. I learned a lot tagging along with my dad at Christmas time for the Santa Claus Fund, helping poor people, disadvantaged people. Dad would joke with the adults and he would tease the kids. There was never any pity nor condescension from Dad with any of them. Mom and Dad taught me to celebrate the seasons of our lives. It was the best school I ever attended.
Amen. That's cool.
Yes, but crazy. You just lived it. It was normal. It was just what everybody did, and it's just, it seems so foreign to so many people now with declining church attendance and I guess, what is it, the nons, the NONES, nons being the largest growing demographic, and that doesn't say that they're not spiritual and they're not out doing great things, but like my whole next generation of nephews and nieces, like 23, I don't know one of them in church regularly, and yet they're magnificent human beings out, climate change and poverty work and building communities, So one of the breakthroughs for me, Brian, when I said, okay, how do I tell my story? Because it's going to sound like a dinosaur. And of course, I had a great nephew telling me that I was probably living in dinosaur Jurassic Park times, and he's 12 years old. And I was sitting Good Friday in Toronto in one of my pandemic isolation moments after coming back from a Mexican raiding trip in 2020. And my beautiful, gorgeous niece, Claire, I think she was pulling a leg a little bit, but she was still saying, well, Uncle Rick, what's this? So what's so special about Good Friday today? And then she would say, what's that day you put the black mark on your... So anyway, I went for a walk in Hyde Park, which is kind of like the Central Park for Toronto. And it dawned on me, I said, this is how I want to tell my book story. And this is how I'm going to shake off the dinosaur. I'm going to tell my story in the book to Claire and her 12-year-old with their interruptions, their comments. It allowed me to bring COVID in. It allowed me to bring Trump and Biden in. It allowed me to bring Black Lives Matter in, some of the Indigenous stuff going on in Canada with residential schools. So it was a huge breakthrough and a aha moment. The good old dog walk. Some of the best things happen on my dog walk, where I work with my books and my characters. And I said, that's what I'm going to do. And it just breathed a whole new life that I can still go back and tell the old story. But because I was telling it to a niece in 2020, 2021, she would interrupt. She'd make her comments. I talked about a time when kids wanted to go to my faith communities because it was a place of action. It was alive. It was the teenagers. It was guitars. It was the kids doing all the ministries. In the summer, we did a 10-week musical production. And like, I had one Protestant mother call me one night and she says, I'm sorry, Father Rick. I'm embarrassed. I said, I'm just checking on my kid. Is my kid really at your church every night like she says she is? I said, she sure is. And I would tell Claire that, and she says, well, not now. I'm sure there's hubs. I mean, there's some gorgeous individual good faith communities alive and well, and good things going on. I'm not making sweeping statements here, but it really felt like another time long ago that some people today were just, shaking their head and saying, no, I don't know that church. My kids don't know that, don't know the church. And it leaves me sad, but I'm also aware that I say at the end, I'm still standing. I'm still believing. I'm always a bit astonished by that I'm still standing and I'm still believing. But I believe in this big God who loves us. I still, just like priest days, go back to Matthew Fox and original blessing. And, the ideals are there. They're somewhat bruised with all of my stories and some of the tragedies and some of the losses in my life. But the faith is there, and it's tied to what my parents, taught me. I may have left some of the rituals and some of those devotions, behind, but my best times are walking, praying. I remember the Jesuits' examination of conscience that I used to do, and now I just lay my head on a pillow and I do one good thing and one struggle every day. And I said, my God, like that's 45 years ago, the examination of conscience that I was taught. And I've sort of fashioned it into something that works for me still.
Well, faith takes a lot of different forms, doesn't it? And, who are we to judge which is right and which is wrong, quote unquote, so I'm glad.
Well, Brian, there's a whole bunch of people that would just love to do that, to judge, right or wrong. And it's a bit of the dualism, that I never was drawn to, that I was never drawn to that part of the priesthood. I love the mystery part. And there are days I joke about, a cop out, it's a mystery, but it is a mystery to live, and yet we live in times where you got to pick your sides, and you see the division in families, the blue and red states in your country, and we have our different colors up here. It's hard, like it's so hard. I admire the work you do and the work that your networks do to challenge that, to have a conversation, to work on healing, to find places that across, we can do something other than shout and yell and, judge each other. But it's difficult.
Well, on that point, there was one thing I really was caught about your book. At one point, you discovered Robert Johnson's concept of the Mandola. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Had you ever heard of that?
No, have
okay.
not.
So most people haven't, and I hadn't. So it's the 90s. I've left for marriage, and I'm working now, leading a executive director for a church ecumenical coalition, which ironically I went from the Catholics to 11 religion bodies, including Quakers and Mennonites and Salvation Army, and all the Protestants, and the Conference of Catholic Bishops. We're one of the 11.
Good.
And one day, my dear friend and colleague, Lorraine Burzans, who just a remarkable woman, I tell stories on her in the book. She comes in with this dog-eared copy, as she always did with a book she loved, with 45 yellow stickies sticking out of it. And she reads this section from Robert Johnson. And I don't know exactly whether he is a Jungian, but definitely from a psychological point of view of the Mandola. And it's an Italian word for almond sliver. So if you imagine that almond sliver, it's really tiny. And he talked about two overlapping circles, just barely overlapping with this Mandola, with the almond sliver. And he saw that that was the place of healing. This is the place of justice. This is the place of conversation. And as we met there and do our work there, that circle overlap can grow. So what are the two opposing circles? For me in the NG work, it was offenders and victims of crime, two separate worlds that we wanted to bring together. We said, there's better things than hanging young offenders. There's better things than the death penalty. There's better things than just throwing away the key. And yet we wanted a justice that was serious, that we wanted offenders to take responsibility. And so we used that Mandola, and we went out in the country and we piloted examples. So typical of your country, we also had significant racism issues. And there was in Nova Scotia, a beautiful Black African community that had been there 200 years. And also, of course, beautiful Black Baptist churches. And so they never, ever got invited by the Christian Catholic churches, whether they be evangelical or Roman Catholic. So we put everybody together. And that was the first thing of interest. The locals were commenting that we, the outsiders, had brought together people that live together, but don't talk. Mm-hmm. And they had to deal with racism and the seniors. And there was a great divide between the Black seniors and the white seniors at first. But then because of scripture, you could just see a little bit of conversation starting. And then they started talking about their fears for their young people. And everybody had those fears. And so we could see dramatically this little sliver, this little mandola growing. Now, we could have gone everywhere. I mean, we were just one little NGO group, you know, and we wrote about it. And I write about it in the second book. And there's so much more I could have said about that concept. But it's Robert Johnson who says it much better and explains it at great length in owning your own shadow. Because of course, that's the other thing within ourselves, you know, we live in a dualism world where, you know, they're bad, we're good. Well, the truth, of course, is, you know, who is it? Alexander Solzhenitsyn and the Gulag, and wrote about, you know, the truth is, you know, he said, wouldn't it be easy if we just, you know, got all the bad people and got rid of them? and then he talks about the good and bad cutting right through his heart. And of course, that's shadow work, and whether it's gays and we judge them, you know, we throw things that we don't really want to look at within, and we put it on other people. And so Bishop in Rhode Island that I quote in the book, that also got lots of press, that I tell a story here, you know, he can order Catholics not to attend any pride events, and he can talk about sin and disorder, you know. And I just had to revisit all of that in my book because, again, it was all Mandola work. The awareness that it's always more complicated than good and bad and right and wrong and judgment. There are times that, yeah, we have to make those kinds of statements, but often enough, it's just so complicated, and it begins with ourselves. And if we reflect, so what I do in the book is another reason I went back to storytelling is rather than preach and argue and debate and call everybody bad, I said, I have no problem with ignorance. I said, it's just staying ignorant that I have a problem with. You know, ignorance is okay, but can we ask questions? Can we learn? You know, have you ever talked to a transgendered person? Can you name an individual, a person? Can you put a face? Can you tell a story? You know, so to me, it completely shifts the conversation when you stop debating statistics and right and wrong and scripture quoting and warfare back and forth, and you tell these stories. And I think probably Jesus was a pretty smart guy to tell stories that figured out, you know, that it was storytelling that people really, you know, woke up and listen. And so one of the things I love right now, Brian, about being an author that I had no idea was ever going to happen, I call them love notes. You get these notes from readers afterwards, and it's like they go to confession to you. Like, these are complete strangers, and they don't talk about my stories. They tell their stories to me in their emails to me.
Wow.
And
Cool.
I get so excited because I know that I wanted that to happen, but I wasn't sure that would happen. And so, you know, and they're very different. It's not all rah, you know, yay God and yay church, you know. Some people talk about the good old days, and some say they were good old bad days, like my dad used to call them.
Mm.
One woman said she left at 10 years of age and never walked inside a church because she slept over one night. She saw her girlfriend's father hit his wife and abuse a child. And the next day he was the usher, just a good man in church, you know, hugging everybody. And she said, that was my last day in church at 10 years of age. So that was that's not in the book, but that was an email this woman sends me.
Wow.
So I'm not saying that I'm happier that I get good stories versus bad stories. It's just that my stories laid down to people seem to have resonated with a whole bunch of people. And one woman who I do know, she emailed me and she said, your damn book, it took me a month to read, because she said, I was putting it down so many times, thinking and remembering and going back and wondering what I had done with all of that stuff. And a woman also in the Bruce Peninsula in Canada said to me, she said, I thought it was all an heirloom in the attic. And she says, your book has disturbed me profoundly in the best possible way. And because I was worried, I said, oh no, I've I do have some warnings in one chapter on clergy abuse and in one chapter in residential schools where I give that warning, that necessary warning for people to take care of themselves, because they may have themselves have experienced that. But no, she said, this was the best sense. She said, I have a lot to think about because of your book. And a young millennial woman said, I don't go to church, but I respect you and I respect religion. But she says, I understand that I have 2 children, 7 and 8, and I've never sat down yet to articulate to myself my creed. What do I believe in? Thank you for giving me that in your book. I never said a word about that in the book. I thought, but that's what she got, So it's these, that all from the Mandola, that I think that whether it's shadow work or we just have to find that place. And I so admire compassionate Christianity and healing the divide. And that's the light to me. That's hope. I said, people connecting and talking and trying to overcome these polarized worlds.
Absolutely. I totally agree. So you had another really interesting quote in the book by Sartre. Freedom is what we do with what is done to us. And it sounded like that had a pretty significant impact on you at some point.
It did, and it does. My father and my son did not know each other. I'm a believer in the kingdom of God. They now are best friends. They're totally 2 characters. They would have loved each other on this earth, but it wasn't meant to be. My dad died early at 70. And of course, that was when I was a priest, and Adam was yet to happen in my life. But they both had this notion that the cards dealt both of them were hard, difficult. My dad, me full of it as an adolescent, didn't respect. It's not that I didn't respect him. I didn't get him. I didn't understand. So I used to think, I'm smart. I have 2 degrees. He doesn't have 1. He left in grade 9. Well, he left in grade 9 because he had to take care of his mother, and it was the dirty 30s. And there was a little bootlegging operation going on apparently, but they're at this hotel, and she was a vaudeville star. And she would dump her kids, her 4 kids, in an orphanage, sometimes for up to 6 years. My dad was in an orphanage. So he was in an orphanage. He was in the dirty 30s. He was in the trenches in Italy, 4 years fighting, separated from his fiancée, my mom. And he had a lot of reasons to have a chip on his shoulder. But he had this thing in life about be not afraid, choose life. And in a way, what Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, we don't get always to pick what happens to us, but we have real freedom in what we do with what happens to us. And same thing with my son, Adam, epilepsy and not the right person that he felt that he was out of sorts and dealing with harassment. And he would complain on Facebook, but he had a wicked sense of humor. And he was back in the sun the next day. Once he got everything off his chest on Facebook, he'd be back in his sunny place. And so I think both of them, the generation above me and the generation below, it made sense when I read that Jean-Paul Sartre, because I was in a bad place after Adam's death, the tragedy, the grieving, the loss. I tell the story in the first book that it was like a shipwreck. It was like I was in the water holding on the plank. And I actually had a dream one night where I just wanted to let go. I wanted to be with my son. So I didn't have a whole lot of suicidal wishes, but I just longed to be with my son. And in the dream that I tell in the first book, Adam takes the plank that I'm holding on and whacks me over the head, classic Adam, and says, live. I woke up from that dream and my head hurt so hard, so bad. But he was telling me, don't you dare join me now. Your time will come whenever. Choose life. And so I had read this Jean-Paul Sartre thing about freedom is what we do with what is done to us. And I've said it over and over and over again as a mantra. And I have to be careful because in the book I talk about it, but I said, I don't want to prescribe it like take 2 aspirins, because life is damn hard. is really hard. And some people, because of the color of their skin or their gender, life's hard. So I don't just want to glibly say that line, but I think it's something if you just people can sit with and really, reflect on, because now we have we have it in Ottawa, just like you guys have it down there. Everybody was surprised that the nice Canadians were having these freedom fighters and convoys, and we had a city that was under occupation for weeks. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't proud to look at the Canadian flag, because they were all using the flag in all the wrong ways, and they all wanted their freedom. And there were a few church pastors going to court. They lost all their battles about the freedom to worship, our right to worship, and yet my dad would have just wanted to sit down with those boys and say, okay, you want to know what freedom is? It's being 4 years separated from the girl I loved so that we would have freedom in our world, in our country. Do you want to know what freedom is? It's ration, it's coupons, it's curfews at 10 o'clock at night. It's sacrificing, it's thinking of the common good. It's remembering that we're all caught up in a community, and that there's not just rights, but there's responsibilities. So that's more or less what the judges decided in all the cases. And there weren't many church pastors, but there were a few very vocal that just felt. And I said, oh my God, have they not sat in front of Jesus on the cross and just stared for 5 minutes to get the message on what freedom is and sacrifice? So to me, it was not any kind of Christianity. And in the book, because I do talk about abuse, because I talk about some awful things that happened with the Indigenous and the genocide, there's no other word for it, that happened in the Canadian residential schools. I also praise the good priests, and there's many. I tell this story that hundreds have died. I knew hundreds by the time I wrote it. It's probably more. Hundreds have died from COVID in Italy alone. Some of them elderly, but most of them out doing what good priests do, ministering to the sick and dying, and catching COVID and dying. And I said, so it's again, this dualism that I just reject, this dualism that it's all good or it's all bad. I understand why people leave. Some people tell me their story, and I go, you had to leave for your sanity, your safety, your self-preservation, your worth, no judgment. But there's others that I admire who stay and fight the good fight and push back, and there's some that are called to that. So I try to bring that all, people said, oh, you wrote a faith memoir. Like, I almost see it, their wheels turning in their head saying, oh, faith memoir, rolling their eyes. I said, just read it. Just read it. I said, there's a lot of humor, there's a lot of mischief, there's a lot of irreverence, and there's some damn serious and sobering stuff too. And it's all, it's right beside each other.
Well, Rick, good for you, for doing this. And I'm really glad to hear, the reaction that you've gotten from people that have read it. I know it's a great book. So congratulations on that. And hope you have some more great material to put together for another book at some point.
Oh, there's lots of material, Brian, and I'm going off to novels. I still got to write my dad and mom's war story, which is quite a story. I'm going to time travel back and be a member of his platoon, and that's going to be a fun thing. But I'm really interested to get into some novels, and that's why I need more dog walks, so I could have all these characters, and figure out who lives and who dies, and
good for you.
All these things, in my fiction.
Well, again, the name of the new book is Father Rick, Roamin Catholic, Roamin, and you can learn more about it at rickprashaw.com, rickprashaw.com. So, Rick, congratulations again, and thanks so much for sharing all your book and interesting stories with us.
Thank you, Brian. I really enjoyed this.